Hey everyone, it's Melody here with the Thoughtful Studio design team on the Design by Melody YouTube channel today. I have been on this quest to organize my craft studio for like months, and it's going to be ongoing probably for months more. But one of the things I actually went through the other day was a plastic bucket I have that I usually just throw a bunch of memorabilia in. And these are just things that I might want to include in my scrapbooks, and some extra photos that I always come across end up in this bin as well. So I was going through it the other day just to kind of organize it because it was overflowing. And I came across these 3 pieces of paper where I had a whole bunch of handwritten notes on it. So I took a look at them and I realized what they were. They were actually notes from a conversation I had with my aunt a couple years ago. This layout is actually from May of 2018, but I think the conversation was before that. However, because I had this photo of my dad, this is like a portrait of my dad, a painting of my dad. I believe this is the one that we had at his funeral up by the casket. But this is a photo of when my mom and dad were on a cruise, I believe is actually when this was taken. But since I have a picture of that sitting up on the mantle at my mom's house, I decided to go ahead and include the notes from that story or that conversation with my aunt on this same layout because it's primarily about my dad. And I only have 2 other photos on this weekly spread. This is when I was doing weekly spreads in my albums. This is actually May 21st through May 27th, 2018. So I have a photo at the bottom of Kaylin or Ernest teaching Kaylin how to mow the grass. And then I have a photo of just the sky on the right. So really and I guess I do have that one small photo on the right, and you cannot tell what that is. But what that is, that's a tombstone, a picture of a tombstone of my dad's grandfather and grandmother. So my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, and I didn't know them, even though I guess they died when I was still very young, or my great-grandmother died when I was still very young, I think is how it worked. I honestly don't know the exact details, but I don't remember her at all. Either way, they are mentioned, or at least the grandfather is mentioned in some of these stories, so I thought it was appropriate to also include that here. Plus, it's not like I go visit their gravesite very often, so I thought it would just be a good place to document that. If it never ends up in my albums ever again, at least I know it's in here somewhere. So I'm going to read you the text as to what I included from the stories, and I want you to just kind of take a look at the process of me putting this layout together. I really wanted a lot of the focus to be on the story, and so I'm using some pretty basic embellishments here. So I'm using the papers from the Thoughtful Studio Tess-a-Penpal collection, and this is a digital kit that is available. You can purchase the physical kit as well. You just go to the Thoughtful Studio Etsy shop, and I always have that linked in the description box. And plus I have a blog post with every process video that I post, and I always have the links to those shops and everything in to the shop and the collection in that blog post as well. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the story just to kind of give you some context as you're watching me put this layout together. So it basically just jumps right in. I've heard stories over the years from Daddy about his childhood, but I recently had a chance to talk to my Aunt Becky, who wanted to share some of the stories she remembers. Here are a few of the details she told me. Now, mind you, I'm going to interrupt for a second. Mind you, my dad died a couple years before this, so this is a conversation I had with my aunt after he died. And I did add a few of the details that my dad has told me over the years as well into the story to kind of fill in a few of the gaps. All right, so back to the story. Their granddaddy would give each of them 25 cents to go to Mr. Holmes' corner store for candy. Daddy was very particular about his candy, saving his and only eating a little at a time to make it last. Aunt Becky and Uncle Larry would eat all theirs quickly and would try to bribe Daddy into sharing his with them, but he rarely shared much. And to give you a little bit more context, because I didn't really include all the details, my dad is the youngest of 3, and him and his older sister, he had a brother and a sister. Then Aunt Becky was the oldest, my Uncle Larry was the middle, and then my dad was the last. And him and my aunt were really, really close. Okay, they had many different pets over the years, but one of the favorite pets was a skunk named Ruby. Papa had ordered a deodorized skunk for the family pet. Daddy loved Ruby and would let her out to play because he felt she needed to be outside. One day, she just never came back. So these are just little clips of stories that I've been told. They always had ponies. There was Blaze, who was brown and white. He would run to meet them at the bus after school. Kelly was another one. Then there was Rebel, who was orange with a white mane and tail. Rebel was a big deal because Papa had ordered him as a registered pony. And as you're going through my albums, a lot of times, if I have any of photos from my old, I try to include photos that I come across of like my dad when he was little, or my mom when he was little, or my grandmother when she was young, things like that. And some of these, there's pictures of the ponies throughout my albums in different places, so this references those. Daddy was really close with Aunt Becky. He was viewed as the perfect child because he was the youngest and really didn't get into much trouble. His nickname as a child was the baby. And then the last paragraph. Daddy was very close to Uncle Fred and their Granddaddy George, too. Granddaddy George built houses and worked at the A&E mill. Daddy loved to build things as well. He and Uncle Larry helped Pawpaw build the shop. They also built their own treehouse and cleared paths in the woods for riding their bikes. They were always finding treasures like arrowheads on the property. Life was hard at times, but they really enjoyed their childhood. So not a ton of detail, just some little excerpts of like different stories and little snippets of stories that I've heard over the years. Things that kind of get lost over time, especially as generations start to pass on. Some of these stories kind of pass on with them, unfortunately. So I thought it would be really nice to include some of these stories in my album. And I actually have printed this same text, the same journaling again, and I will include it in my family history album at one point. I do not frequently double scrap photos or double scrap stories. That is something I try not to do. I just don't have the space for it. But I thought I wanted to include these stories in my daily album. But I also thought it would be really nice to include it in my family history album because I'm trying to include all kinds of stories, not necessarily just about my sisters and my parents as a unit, but also of my parents when they were younger, of my grandmother, of my grandfather, all different stories about our family history. And so I thought that would be really nice to include in that album as well. Again, I do not frequently double scrap photos or stories, but I felt like it was appropriate in this situation. I really liked the idea, and this is what actually made me think to use this collection with this story page. I like the idea of thinking of it as being like mail or a story that's been written down and sent to me, because my dad was young. These are stories of his childhood. My parents weren't married yet. I was nowhere even in the thought of being alive or existing at this point. So I kind of like to look at this as a story to myself, or like a letter written to myself of stories of my dad's childhood. So that's just kind of what made me think of using this Tess-a-Penpal collection to begin with. All right, we are actually coming to the end of this layout. Very simple, but again, I wanted the focus to really be on the stories that I had from my aunt, and just, a little bit about the pictures that are on the layout, but primarily about the stories. You can see some up-close photos here. It's a picture of my dad. There's again a picture of the tombstone. This is just one of those flat tombstones that's like against the ground. And then I have my journaling, as you can kind of see. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you look at the videos available on the screen here, you will see the last layout that I've posted, as well as the last design team layout that I did for the Tess-a-Penpal collection in the Thoughtful Studio company. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you again soon. Bye!